Welcome to this, the first in a 4-month series titled Message from America, featuring political and security analyst Dr Paul Buchanan. This week, we crossed to Florida to discuss the vibe on the ground and the fallout for President Donald Trump over the race riots in Charlottesville.
Hello from sunny Florida. It's 30 degrees Celsius, about 10 meters from me, and although it's about 20 degrees Celsius inside here, and the beach is another 30 meters down the road, so a little different than back home.
You haven't got jellyfish and man-of-war jellyfish and lice and things like that in the water that keep you out, or you got a pool?
Oh no, there's jellyfish. We were down in Key West with some New Zealand friends, as it turns out, this past weekend, and went out to some reefs for snorkeling, and there was some jellyfish out there, and but that didn't discourage us from going and looking at the fishies, and saw some barracuda and some sharks, and it was all good. It was all good. Well, spent a lot of time drinking a local drink called a hurricane.
A hurricane. So that's a bit
I'll tell you
different.
what, it's a hurricane the next morning when you get up.
It's like the prelude to the hangover type of thing.
Yeah.
Paul, so obviously, the vibe around you in Florida is, if you're looking inside, it's obviously a pretty good trip at the moment. But what's the vibe in Florida relating to this latest in the Trump fiascos?
Well, let's remember that Florida is, in fact, the South. And where I am, which is the southeast corner, I'm about 45 miles north of Miami, is a fairly liberal enclave. But the rest of Florida is the South. And when we were over on the West Coast 2 or 3 weeks ago, that's Trump land over there. And what you get the sense is there is a degree of disenchantment by some voters, and then there is a considerable degree of staunchness and resistance by Trump voters who simply either don't believe he's done anything wrong or don't want to admit that voting for him may have been a mistake. That, of course, was before Charlottesville, and things have clearly hit the fan. Right now, the question is he in a death spiral? Or, as so many other times, will he survive yet another scandal and be able to push his agenda?
So what's your answer to this, Paul? Is is it Trump's Waterloo, for example, at the moment?
It could well be. He may have overreached himself. And, of course, let's remember that Steve Bannon has orchestrated this, the cultivation of a base that is openly racist. I mean, it is an amazing thing to sit here and watch a sitting president of the United States doing that false moral equivalence between people who are trying to render witness and resist Klansmen and Nazis walking in the streets of a U.S. city, and the Nazis and the Klansmen themselves. And let's think of this for a second. 72 years ago, the Nazis were defeated on European soil. Last weekend, they marched in Charlottesville in uniforms with Nazi flags, shouting anti-Semitic and Nazi slogans.
Well, this
is an incredible moment.
Let's have a look at that. I've got some footage, obviously. There's a lot of footage around, but this is amazing stuff that you actually sent across. I'll just bring that up. It will take a couple of seconds, and we'll just show people exactly what you're talking about. Now, this is on Vice News. This is let's see.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! 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 Whose streets? Our streets! 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 Our streets!
Amazing kind of footage there, obviously, that's going on. What we're seeing is even the shots of the boots going down the streets, which obviously has got overtones to another era on the European continent. So, you mentioned Bannon there. There's been talk, I've been watching, say going back a month, that the power of Bannon was starting to recede in the White House, but understand that he's actually making, his power base is getting around him. It sounds like Trump is receptive to him again. Is that correct along that line?
I think so. I think that what may have happened is that Bannon has always been the preferred voice whispering in Trump's ear from the get-go. Okay, he likes that ethno-nationalist rhetoric. It's economic nationalist as well as racial in orientation. But in the struggles within the White House between what I'll call realists or pragmatists, people like McMaster, people like now General Kelly as the chief of staff, Bannon's fortunes ebbed and flowed depending on the whim of the president from day to day. And so sometimes when Bannon's ideas didn't float and didn't progress, didn't win Trump any accolades, then he'd be on the outers. But as other areas of endeavor have not materialized for the president, I mean, he's gone nowhere in his agenda other than the appointment of one Supreme Court justice. But obviously there's no health care happening. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing to show for 6.5 months of his presidency. So he's returned to the fold. He's listening to Bannon, and what Bannon is saying to him is these people are your core. These people will never leave you. These people are larger in numbers. They're a silent majority. That now is the time to bring them out onto the streets to demonstrate that there's a lot more of them than people think. And that's the big question. Are they in the numbers that Bannon seems to think they are? I would hope not. I would hope that although they may be in the thousands, that the vast majority of 330 million Americans repudiate what they represent. But we don't know those numbers, and some of the things that have been interesting is they're coming to fight. They're heavily armed. In the case of Charlottesville, they outgunned the local police. The governor had to call in the National Guard to get these guys to leave, and this was after the murder. And so there's a question as to how big is this base, this racist base?
We get back to perhaps the vibe that you're picking up in Florida. Now, you know, it was always understood that the Panhandle was very strong Republican. But and obviously Florida is a Republican state, and it's certainly came through for Trump in the election. But what's the vibe there amongst Republicans themselves now? Are you seeing that watered down, that they're really saying, hey, this guy is a nutcase, we've got to get something else in the White House here? And are those moves in evidence?
Well, it's been interesting since my arrival 3 weeks ago and some of the stuff I've seen in the last few days. One of the things that's been very unpleasant about coming back to the South is that even polite company now mention racist things, that people should know their place, that things like Black Lives Matter have pushed too far. I mean, this is in polite society. Where I'm living here is, it's a polite crowd. And now they're uttering things that 10 years ago, you would never utter outside your own house. But what's happened is these events of the last weekend and let's just say the crude displays of behavior we saw in Charlottesville on the part of the alt-right crowd has embarrassed people. These well-heeled people, traditional Republicans are like, armed guys, skinheads in the streets with Trump not disavowing them. That's not good for business. Okay, that's just not good. And here's lies the rub. Trump, for whatever reasons, and not disavowing them strongly, has now alienated himself. He's increasingly isolated from the most important constituencies that he needs, and those are corporate America, which is abandoning him like a sinking ship, and the Republican Party in Congress. He's turned around now on people who have criticized him for his weak response, and he's lambasting them. Well, he needs those people to pursue any legislative agenda. It's starting to get pretty ferociously personal between him and leading Republicans. So one gets the sense this is a guy starting to spin out of control. And, they're coming back. Right now, Congress is on recess. And they'll come back over the American Labor Day weekend, which is around September 1st. They'll come back. They're going to be saddled with an albatross of a president and a legislative agenda that will not prosper a year and 3 months ahead of midterm elections, which if they lose, then they're done. Then there's nothing Republican. over the next 3 years. So the
What-
Republican Party right now is in crisis as well.
Yeah. What I've noticed too is a week ago, like you mentioned, the recess, a week ago, the statements coming out of the House of Representatives, the representatives themselves, had dribbled down to very little. But since Charlottesville, it has increased as if they're all back in the House. So there's obviously a lot that they're wanting to say. They're obviously wanting to stake their ground, obviously picking up the mood within the party. Interesting stuff there to watch. Also, what is interesting too, Paul, is on KiwiPolitico.com that you've written a piece there. And I'll just quote the opening paragraph of your latest piece, Letters from America, and it says, Donald Trump picked a scab during his campaign for the presidency, and now the pus is draining out. Now, what have we got there? And also, the question here, is he really trying to empower and validate the alt-right, and is he really determined to actually get the United States looking like some sort of modern day pre-World War II Nazi Germany or something? I mean, the alt-right seem to be determined to actually get that narrative on the board.
Right. I mean, the reason I use such strong language is that, I left the United States in 1997 at what arguably would have been the height of good race relations in the United States. And I thought it was done and dusted. The Klan was finished, except for some fringe elements. There was a few white supremacists about, but it was a done deal. The country was moving to a post-racist future, if you will. And I think what's happened is that it started up under W. Bush. Well, it started up with the Reagan Southern strategy in the 80s, where you cultivated white Southern working class support. The Democrats had abandoned that white working class in the South that had been their base. Republicans took it under Reagan. They did the dog whistle on racial issues, etc. W played a little bit with that. And then we have Obama, a black president elected. That sent these guys into the stratosphere. And they plotted and schemed, aided and abetted by a right-wing media that was very disloyal to Obama, which accentuated and echoed that dog whistle to the point that it became a bugle call that Trump could hear. I don't think that Trump has thought through the consequences of moving to an ethno-state, as these alt-right guys want to do. I mean, the idea that the brown people and black people are going to leave. That's, you wonder what drugs they're taking.
Where would they leave to, for example?
Well, they prefer meth, as it turns out. I mean, look at some of these guys, and you can see what their drug preference is. But the point is this: he has decided that he will empower this group, and now, as president, he's validating them. He's legitimating them as legitimate political movement in a measure that no president has ever done, and quite frankly, I don't think they deserve this. The left has nothing comparable. The left has nothing as armed, nothing as hate-mongering. I mean, one could say, well, there was a bunch of Trotskyites, mixed up with the Antifa movement. Sure, there might have been a bunch of Trotskyites. There was also a lot of clergy people who were, in fact, the people being protected by the Antifa crowd when the car came rolling in down that street looking to kill them all. And so, again, the moral equivalency argument just does not hold water. The trouble with the president, and, again, it's hard for me to even say that word, is that he's so impulsive and he's so ignorant of things like history. I mean, his whole comments about statues displays this gross ignorance to the point that his enabling these folk is out of proportion to whatever political gain he wants to achieve. And the irony here is Bannon may be telling him, look, this core will stay with you as long as you talk a language they can understand. And I didn't realize this until I came here. It turns out the original catchphrase or calling phrase for the Klan in the 30s was America First.
Okay.
He took that phrase and put it in his campaign. I didn't know that. There are coins that are now circulating that have, hooded guys on one side, and on the other side it says America First with a burning cross. So he harked directly to the language of the Klan during his campaign. That was a dog whistle I did not hear, but it was heard by other people, and now we're wearing the consequences of this. One other thing, Selwyn, that protest and counter-protest in Charlottesville was not the only one that weekend. There was a half a dozen white supremacist protests around the country, mostly last weekend in the West. Not all connected to symbols of the Confederacy, but there is clearly a network of racists who have decided to hit the streets in a concerted fashion. In fact, that very, very good Vice documentary mentions some of that. Stormfront, and I don't want to, I've just mentioned them, but some of that crowd coordinate their activities via the internet. And again, they come with their weapons, as they have a right to do. And they're now hitting cities around the country. Now, I would argue that there are some cities they don't want to go to. So if they march in Atlanta, which is a predominantly black city and fairly liberal, they might get a reception they don't really anticipate. But on the other hand, they have constitutional guarantees, and the president is not helping matters. You may have seen the mayor of Phoenix asked him to postpone a campaign-style rally that he's going to hold this weekend in Phoenix after the events of last weekend. He has refused. He's going to go there. He's going to rally his base. And what that means is we're going to see in Phoenix a very possible repetition of the events that we've done in Charlottesville, because the people who want to bear witness against racists and whatnot, they're not going to be intimidated by the death of this young woman. They will show up in Phoenix. And so, we're headed towards a slippery slope. It may not be civil war, but certainly the possibility of bloodshed over the next weeks and months has increased thanks to the president's actions.
Yeah, I was going to go into that with you. What you're describing there is obviously a very divided United States. One that almost could be argued that is divided along the old south and north borders, if you like, if that's accurate. But irrespective of that particular observation, do you see, the possibilities, if Trump does his full term, for example, do you see the possibilities of clashes that could be defined as some sort of civil war in the United States? On racial grounds.
I don't think they're going to get too well. This may be wishful thinking on my part, but I think we have to put this in context. Are there armed extremists in the streets of the United States today? There are indeed. Okay, that is a very worrisome thing. Armed extremists, among other things, are challenging the monopoly over legal force that is normally held by law enforcement and the military. This is a problem for the state. When you have armed guys who are not regulated by the state, i.e. police officers and or military personnel, running around with guns, you have a problem. That would be true for any liberal democracy. The United States, though, has two things I would say in its favor. The first is a little crazy. We have a long history of militias in the United States. We have militias dating back to the days of independence and beyond. And these militias have worked for bad or good. We tend to think of the bad militias, the Aryan nation and whatnot. But in the conquest of the West, as bad as it was for the indigenous Americans of the West, their militias served as local constabularies. They served as, law enforcement, that sort of thing, until the West was settled to the point that you could have an established sheriff's office and the like. Americans are comfortable in a measure that New Zealanders would not be with the presence of armed militias. They're a lot more comfortable. If these guys start acting up, remember that a lot of the armed crowd in the United States are not militia people and wouldn't take kindly to racists all of a sudden pointing their guns willy-nilly in every direction. And that brings in the second part of this, which is every state of the United States has reserve troops for the U.S. military called the National Guard. Army, Navy, Air Force, but mostly Army. And they do a lot of civil defense, when there's flooding or earthquakes and that. The National Guard gets rolled out.
This was what was rolled out with Kent State University all those years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were, and that was very unfortunate that they were. The governor has to declare a state of emergency in order to deploy them, because let's face it, they're reserve forces for the federal government. That's, they come from each state, they're identified by their states, but they're only used in conflicts by the federal government or in conditions of a state of emergency in their home states. The governor of Virginia last weekend invoked that state of emergency in order to get Army reservists down there. And these Army reservists train regularly. I mean, they're military people. They're maybe called weekend warriors, but in the United States, the weekend warriors are a little more than territorials. I mean, these guys are, they train a lot because they deploy a lot. And if these militias take to the streets and start shooting, they will not be met by the left. The left in the United States is pretty much unarmed. And what they bring to the fight are chains and clubs and knives. The other crowd has AK-47s and AR-15s. So it's not a fair fight. But they're not going to be fighting the left. They're going to be fighting the National Guard. The governors of these states are not going to allow, again, it's a challenge to the sovereignty of the state to have these guys running around with an armed insurrection. And if the National Guard of a state can't handle them, then under emergency federal legislation, the federal government can. Therein lies a problem. Will Donald Trump invoke that legislation in an event, let's say Alabama starts getting overrun by Klansmen? And there's the problem. Right now, on right-wing media, there are people openly talking about the fact that if the president is impeached, or if the Robert Mueller investigation of his possible connections with the Russians during his campaign leads to indictments of people around him, if not himself, then he might call for his supporters in this alt-right base to rise up and attack the fake news media, to attack the deep state, to attack the conspirators who are trying to bring him down. Okay. If he does that, that's treason. I mean, that's at that point things hit the fan. But that's actually now being discussed by right-wing media.
Well, let's look at the power base of Trump right at the moment. We saw after Charlottesville and after his explosions in New York and Trump Tower, as I understand it, there before the media in the post, era of him trying to actually gain some sort of credibility again. And he explodes with this divisive kind of talk that you mentioned earlier on. And you saw the chief of staff in particular with his head right down, his chin was on his chest basically, and the others looking like they're thinking, oh my God, what's this guy doing here? Now, if that's what is closest and most powerful, remember, they're not sycophantic kind of flakes, are they? They're hard guys that have gone through the grill to get to those positions that they're in. What does that suggest about his ability to sustain his own politics, his own power base in the White House? And secondly, is impeachment not gone on the scale of probabilities up beyond the 5 and closer to the 10, if you know what I mean?
Well, first of all, with regards to that unbelievable spectacle of the interview in the lobby, which I watched live, one of the unpleasant ironies of watching him rant and rave was that standing behind him were two very senior economic advisors, both of whom were Jewish, and who they got to listen to him do that false moral equivalence between the people that we just saw in that documentary clip and people who were protesting against them. They didn't like that. My understanding is at least one of them is thinking of resigning because he's had enough. As for General Kelly, he shouldn't have taken the job of chief of staff in the first place. The idea that you could corral this guy is akin to saying that you can, herd a bunch of cats, into a box. I mean, it's not going to happen. He clearly is regretting the decision, and so I don't think he's long for this job. I think, and that sends signals out that, okay, things have reached a point where not even a decorated Marine general can impose discipline on this Oval Office. It also raises the question of how sustainable can this be? And one thing that's been interesting is that, and you and I and other venues have talked about this, is you look at this, the 6 months, and you say, okay, it simply is not sustainable to go from scandal to scandal to crisis to scandal to crisis to scandal, especially when 99.9% of all of them are self-made by Trump. You simply can't sustain the pace. However, there is a thread of thought in D.C. that Bannon has advised Trump that when he gets in trouble with any crisis or scandal of his own making, start a new one. Now, you'd say this is nuts, but let me ask you this, Selwyn. You're an avid reader of the news. I'm an avid reader of the news. Can you and I remember any specific scandal or crisis from March, April, or May?
Yeah, it's clever stuff in a sense, isn't it? It's like, what's it, the old David Bowie song, putting out fire with gasoline, in a sense.
Yeah, if you keep on going from scandal to scandal, it does two things. It normalizes in the public mind the idea that the White House is supposed to be chaotic. It's supposed to be tumultuous. It's all about wrestling and fighting and whatnot, when in fact it's not. It's actually supposed to be about rationality and calm. So it normalizes this idea that scandals occur all the time, and then it numbs us. Every day there's another outrage, to the point that I can't remember the outrages of March, April, or May. I know there was a bunch of them, but I'm too preoccupied with the things he's just said in the last 3 or 4 days. And if that is, in fact, a real concerted strategy by Bannon, this will be the test. Okay. Up until now, I'm like, okay, he can do this. But this one, see, Selwyn, there's an interesting thing here. Moving to New Zealand, I've heard veterans, World War II veterans, they speak about the Japanese. And there's always these comments, well, if it wasn't for the Americans, we'd be speaking Japanese and that sort of thing. Nazis walking the streets of the United States. I'm the son of a World War II veteran who jumped into France on D-Day. My whole generation are sons and daughters of World War II veterans. There are a few World War II veterans around anymore, but the thought that you defeated Nazism in Europe 72 years ago, and they are now openly marching in the streets, abetted by the president, is too much to take for that crowd. And that crowd voted for him. All those old vets and whatnot, they were disproportionately represented amongst his supporters. I mean, look at the crowds behind him at his rallies. It's old guys with, veteran caps on, and I served here and I served there. Well, this has definitely broken them off when it comes to support, because they're like, no, we watched our brothers die fighting this. So I really think this could be the tipping point. And it does. I mean, his mental state has to be questioned, because now things are starting, again, spiral out of control, where he's lashing out at Republicans for the mere fact that they said to him, you should have been more forceful in denouncing the racists. Okay, so we'll see where we go in the next few weeks.
If he's gone beyond the line of, narcissism, personality disorder, or however he could be defined, and he's gone into being basically nuts in ordinary language, is that a grounds for impeachment? And if so, is Vice President Pence ready to govern?
Well, two distinct things. As for Pence, yeah, he's ready to govern. He's got some medieval views of women and gender relations. He's no friend of feminists. He's no friend of the gay and lesbian and transgender community. But he served in Congress. He's someone that can be reasoned with, and he knows about the art of compromise. Trump is none of those things. So I'll take Pence if it comes to that, because he might be controllable in the sense that he'll voluntarily listen to his aides and try to make a reasoned choice, even though it may be a very conservative choice. Now, with regards to Trump, and I'm not entirely sure he'll get to impeachment. I have a feeling that he might resign rather than be impeached. But let's run the basics of impeachment. Impeachment occurs in the following way. the offenses that the president commits, or any politician can be impeached, are known as high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, that's a loosely defined catchphrase. I mean, Bill Clinton was impeached for perjury over a sexual act.
Yeah, or
right?
his definition of what was sex or what wasn't.
Right. So it's a loose definition of what constitutes high crime and misdemeanors. But the way it works is that the House of Representatives works as the prosecutor. And they file the articles of impeachment, if they find them, by 2/3 majority. They need a 2/3 majority. And they present those articles to the Senate, which acts as a judge and jury and has to convict based on a 2/3 majority. That's how Clinton escaped. They impeached him, but the Senate couldn't get a 2/3 majority to convict him and oust him. So, excuse me. So what's happening now is, does Trump's activities rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors? If he continues down this path, and especially if he urges the alt-right to hit the streets with armed force, quite frankly, that's treason. That is a high crime. But more importantly, we haven't talked about Robert Mueller's investigation into the connections between his campaign and the Russians. That's been bubbling along quietly. In fact, Mueller is being very quiet right now. And one theory is that this whole thing about race is a diversion from the investigation. Otherwise, that investigation would be on the front pages. It's off. Now, Mueller is a consummate prosecutor. He has now impaneled 3 grand juries, 2 in Virginia and 1 in Washington, looking at 3 different criminal aspects of the connection between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Even if Trump fires Mueller, and to do that he would have to get his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to do it, that investigation will continue. And in the measure that it continues, it's not going to be good news for the president. There's already word that plea bargain offers have been put out to some of the closest people, including General Flynn, to exchange lighter sentences for the dirt on what Trump knew and when he knew it.
Well, if that's true, that suggests they've got more than a prima facie case. They're actually starting to line up the pins and ready to roll the ball.
Absolutely, they are. And so if he fires Mueller, that's obstruction of justice. That's a crime. And again, if he exhorts his crowd to, get crazy in the streets, that's treasonous behavior. You're inciting violence, that sort of thing. So he can let the investigation go and not obstruct it, in which case he could wind up indicted. And in which case he'll be removed from office. He'll be impeached immediately. So his options right now are limited to none, all against the political backdrop of impending midterm elections in 14 months. I mean, his support base inside of D.C. is all but eroded. There's very few people left willing to put themselves on the line for him. And so, his days may be numbered, but I would be more forceful in saying that, except that he's wriggled out of other scandals.
Mace, man. We need first aid!
You got mace?
Yeah.
By who?
By Connie.